Hey, Tettles, do you know if you type /key, if you have details and other people in your group have details, you don't have to do exclamation point keys anymore and see you as that weak or whatever. It just pops up the whole list.
Yeah, it also pops up right in your guild too. It's not even just
insane tip.
It's not just the people in your party, but it's everybody in your guild. That is actually an insane tip.
Yeah, which can be very helpful this season, because this season, which person has which keys might affect which person in your guild you invite to do a little key after raid.
Okay, so I think that this week we wanted to talk about just general dungeon difficulty in Season 1. I feel like there's a lot that's been going on with just, general Season 1 dungeon difficulty. First off, if you haven't done these dungeons, I would recommend going and reading like a Wowhead guide, maybe pop that up and kind of take a gander at like what's going on in the dungeons. There's also a lot of different tips and tricks that you probably need to know for a lot of these keys this season, because this season is ridiculous.
Yeah, so different dungeons have a sort of different difficulty profile, right? Like, You've got dungeons like Court of Stars and Shadow and Burial Grounds that have a few tricky mechanics, but for the most part are pretty forgiving, have a pretty forgiving timer. And so you see a lot of people pretty quickly gravitating towards those two being like the easy ones. Then there's dungeons like Halls of Valor that, are maybe relatively okay on the timer, although that timer is a lot tighter than it was back in Legion, but that have mostly simple pulls, and then like
it's fairly fine.
Persia,
if you
very hard encounter.
If you pull aggressively in Halls of Valor, in my experience, then you're able to time the key. And this is requiring you to like double up on a couple of pulls and stuff like that. But these are pulls that you can double up on reasonably.
And then you've got the kind of Dragonflight dungeons, which tend to be the hardest ones you can roll your key into this time around, right? Now, perhaps to some extent, we're seeing just an effect of like, okay, people are unfamiliar with these and there's remembered strategies from the older dungeons, but especially with Court of Stars having been a recent Legion time walking dungeon. But I actually don't think that effect explains most of it. I think there's legitimately just a huge disparity in terms of like how harsh the mechanics are in those dungeons versus in Court and Shadow and Burial Grounds in particular.
Yeah, so I think that just to begin with, I think we could talk about like the knowledge gap, because I think completely anecdotally, there is a massive amount of knowledge that you need for the Dragonflight dungeons in particular, just with how kicks are going to be assigned. Because if you think about it, the most kick-intensive dungeons are like Algathar Academy, Ruby Life Pools, and then probably Jade Serpent. That's probably like the third one, but like
Ruby Life Pools is really harsh. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the amount that one cast will kill you in that dungeon in the upper ring of trash, that's wild.
I did a 21 a couple days ago, and we had 10 deaths in the upper ring, and we chalked that up as a success. Like it is that situation where it is very difficult to get through that upper ring of trash without a bunch of deaths. In addition to that, it's kind of hard to skip any trash in there, and if you pull Flame Goulet, you could be in a world of hurt.
Well, Flame Goulet. I killed that in a 20 this week.
He's a menace.
Bloodlust, yeah.
Yeah, but like, so I think that one of the big things is like the new dungeons are just so much harder than the old dungeons. Shadow and Burial Grounds and Court of Stars, I mean, if we go and take a look at Raider.io, there are 4 dungeons at the 23 level, or 3 Shadow and Burial Grounds or 2 chested at the 23 level, and there are 4 dungeons that are not Shadow and Burial Grounds and Court of Stars that are timed at the 23 level. If I click over, and it's like 1 Jade Serpent, it's 2 Jade Serpents, 1 Knockhood, and 1 Ruby Life Pools at 23. We're all in time. That is ridiculous. Like, and then if you click through the rest of the 22s, all of them are Shadow and Burial Grounds and Court.
Yeah, that's the same story, right?
Like,
and
I'm still going.
Those dungeons 2 chestable as well.
I'm still going. Okay, I found a Jade Serpent at 138. Like,
yeah.
All right. I don't know. I think that there's a major issue with the dungeon balance right now this season, and part of it's due to strategy, but I think that it's just like now there's a question of should they have brought back 4 of the legacy dungeons, because the legacy dungeons seem like they are noticeably easier than the new dungeons.
I don't think that it's like an inherent. Yeah, I don't think it's inherently bad to have the. Like, I mean, I think their dungeons can be too hard, and maybe there's a couple of Dragonflight ones that are like that. But yeah, the big problem is just the disparity, right? Like, any season you have where you complete a key at a certain level and it turns into a new key, and which key that turns into, there's some that you can 2 chest easily, and there's some that you're going to deplete. That is a bad feeling whenever you actually are like running keys at any given level. Now we're talking about 20s because 20s is where the reward threshold ends, and that does mean that like compared to a usual season, raid focused players that are trying to gear up in 20s this time around are doing harder Mythic Plus content than they were, this time in Shadowlands, right? But it's definitely true all the way up the ladder, right? It's just like rolling. If you have a day where your keys are just changing between Court of Stars and Shadow and Burial Grounds, you're going to be 4 key levels higher than if they're changing between Azure Vault and Naka Defensive, right?
And I do think that like calling for nerfs in dungeons is actually a pretty dangerous game, because then you get dungeons that are too easy. But at the same point, I don't even think it's too far-fetched to say that Court of Stars and Shadow Moon deserve a buff in some capacity. And the weird thing is like Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, whenever you think of like buffing dungeons, more often than not, they'll knock down a couple minutes on the timer, and that is a way to effectively nerf Shadow Moon and Court. But Shadow Moon in particular, there just isn't deadly mechanics. And so like unless they're going to rework functionally a lot of how the trash is going to function, that dungeon's just not deadly.
Yeah, and I don't think that you want to nerf those dungeons or like buff them by making the timer shorter either, because then you just get to a point where it's like, okay, it's still easy to do, but one wipe now kills our timer, right? And that's like,
yeah. And then
I don't know. I find those to be unsatisfying depletes whenever it's just like, okay, we did 28 minutes well and 1 minute badly, and the dungeon is gone.
Yeah, and then obviously I think that there are some things that probably need nerfs. Like I generally think that you should like avoid looking to nerf like super early unless you are convinced that things are extreme outliers. Obviously, there's some stuff in Ruby Life Pools that's like I think that most people would say that Overgrown Ancient and Algathar Academy is also kind of similar in that vein. Temple of the Jade Serpent with some compositions feels a bit ridiculous. Like the last boss feels a bit ridiculous. Like those kind of things. But I think you have to be careful with nerfing, as opposed to like, I've never even had this conversation where it's like, should we buff these dungeons? Because some of these dungeons are extreme outliers in the other direction. Like literally, what?
Yeah, it's like the Junkyard effect, right? It's not as bad as Junkyard, but we got 2 mini Junkyards this season in Court and Shadow and Burial Grounds, and yeah, I do think that has a pretty big warping effect on the meta.
How have you been feeling about 20s? So I think that this isn't something that we've talked about in a while. Whenever 20s were announced that they were going to be the new key threshold high, we were pretty positive on it. End of Dungeon rewards for 20s offer 405s, and then the Great Vault offers 421s. But this forces players to do, even at 405 item level, 20s aren't trivial. They're still pretty difficult to deal.
I mean, I think it's worked out well for players in top guilds. I think it's important to remember that that's a pretty small minority of the population that are actually doing that level of content, right? Like, I think that for most people, for a much broader swath of the population, the fact that 20s is the ceiling isn't relevant yet. Like, they're not yet at the 20 key level. And I still think it's good, though, in that case as well. I think it's good to have a higher ceiling, as long as it's not like an unreasonable key level. I think going from 15 to 20 was really good for creating like a push for people that want to be able to do some moderate difficulty pushing in Mythic Plus and get rewarded for it with items and not just score. I
mean, 15 to 16 offer you the same effective level of rewards from the Great Vault and End of Dungeon rewards as they would have in previous seasons. And so basically the 17, 18, 19, 20 are just like cherries on top with like additional gear that you can get out of your Great Vault. I do think that it is like with the dungeon scaling change, making dungeons scale higher in between key levels, and the fact that you need to be pushing for 20s to get into dungeon rewards, it's difficult. I mean, it's definitely made dungeons a lot more difficult. It's made my guild weekly keys, I don't know if you've had a similar experience, but like your group of guildies that do a lot of dungeons versus your group of guildies that weekly no lever keys, there's like a stark difference between the two groups. Yeah,
because 15 was too low to really see that difference. Yeah, because 15... But again, like it depends on what kind of guild you're in, right? I think that's a pretty rare case where that's true right now.
I mean, we're also on one of the easiest dungeon weeks. I mean, we just came off one of the harder ones with Bursting Grievous Tyran as well. I think that some of these bosses on Tyran are noticeably very difficult as well. And I think that like that's a lot of the trash, especially in like the older dungeons, isn't necessarily walling people. More often than not, it's actually been the bosses this season, which in some seasons, Tyran is like pretty good for people who are doing casual level keys. Tyran, more often than not, for people who are doing 15s through like the history of M+, has been the more preferred affix even. It's whenever you see it start to get to higher levels where Tyran becomes really difficult. Now it seems like the bosses are a lot more dangerous in some of these dungeons. I mean, like Quarterstar's last boss is really dangerous. Overgrown Ancient, you know.
I don't know. Some of the bosses though, like they're actually pretty fun to play this season. I've been enjoying the mechanics of some of them, so I think that part's been working out pretty well. I don't know.
I think that overall though, there's like a pretty big miss on the dungeon difficulty, and like I do you expect them to change it? Do you expect them to like bolster up these easy dungeons and like nerf down a little bit on the hard dungeons?
I think nerfing the harder dungeons a bit more is pretty likely. I do think that the buffing the easier dungeons would be good, but I'm not sure they'll actually pull the trigger on that.
I think that's pretty reasonable. It's a weird situation because I think that the hard dungeons are generally too hard, and I think that they've been designing the Dragonflight dungeons, and something that I have noticed is like I feel like the Dragonflight dungeons have too many mechanics. Like I feel like Halls of Valor has actually been the happy medium for amount of mechanics and like difficulty of the dungeon, which is weird because Halls of Valor like for a long time was like one of the harder dungeons mechanically, but whenever you compare it to some of these Dragonflight dungeons, you're like, damn, that is a lot of mechanics so that you have to know how they functionally work.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think the last thing I want to hit on is Thundering. How have you been feeling about Thundering so far? Because I've seen actually a decent amount of community discussion about Thundering just as a general affix, and it's...
I haven't really enjoyed it. I don't know. What do you think?
The last time we talked about it, we were pretty like meh on it. I was like, it's probably fine. And the more I played it, I'm like, damn, I don't like it.
Yeah, it's like 15 seconds is long enough that you feel bad about clearing insta, but not long enough that you get to really enjoy having a damage buff. 30% is not really a big enough damage buff for you to like super feel it either. And then like clearing it is important, but still annoying, especially as a tank. It's often very very tenuous to be able to do. So you're often relying on the other people in your group to kind of know what the tank frontals are in a pull, which is fine. Like it's fine for an affix to reward that kind of knowledge, but I do just feel like it's not one that I've really enjoyed. Like I've not really felt good with the power that it's given me or felt skillful clearing it ever particularly. It just kind of felt like often it kind of feels just pretty meh.
As somebody who has died to tank frontals and has accidentally forgot to clear on my tank, I feel like the tank one is like by far the most annoying. It's like I don't even have really an issue of clearing with melee or healers or anything like that. I feel like just getting clears on the tank is so difficult in some of these dungeons, especially with the amount of frontals and like difficulty of the trash and stuff like that. It's been weird. I don't know. I think that Thundering is, the more I've been playing it, the less I've definitely been enjoying it.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you think? Let us know into comments.
I think general summation though is like the dungeons require a lot of information up front, and you should definitely make sure you're doing research in advance. There's a lot of really good Wowhead articles that have been produced lately in regards to tips. This one right here talking about how to multi-beer in Halls of Valor, and that one makes the timer a lot more lenient. You were talking about HOV timer. I mean, this is one that makes the timer a lot more lenient. Yeah. There's obviously other things too.
We'll put a link to that as well in the everywhere.
Yeah.
That is a good content. A lot of people don't know about that if you didn't play back in Legion.
I mean, there's also stuff like banishing the branch in Algathar Academy on Overgrown Ancient if you have a warlock. There's like a lot of big tech that you can do in these dungeons that you would like to know, I think, going into them.
Yeah.
All right. Overall, something's got to happen with the balance, but I think that's going to be it for us today.
GN.